All right, welcome back to the Bible Bowl study of Second Kings.
That's right.
And this is more of a verse by verse, really pulling out the detail and the facts of the scripture, because that's what Bible Bowl is on the
It is.
New King James
That's right.
Version.
That's important. So remember, all the questions at Bible Bowl will come from the New King James. So
And this is really for everybody to watch too,
yeah,
because
absolutely.
remember and typically, I mean, typically we do this the Wednesday night before Bible Bowl. We'll have everybody in the fellowship hall and do
Yeah.
the Bible Bowl challenge. As far as I know, we're still planning to do that. We'll see
Well, I think we can
September
social
holds.
distance
Yeah,
that enough and spread out the whole
right.
fellowship hall to do that as
We'll
well.
just see what September holds, and but I hope everybody watches this and kind of makes note of some of these facts. But we're
Yeah,
in
for sure.
Second Kings chapter 4 right now, so get your Bibles out.
Yeah.
New King James, look at Second Kings chapter 4 while we're going through this.
So starting off in verse 1, we see that a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets called out to Elisha. And the problem that was going on here, that her husband had died. And at this time in history, widows, which is someone that lost their husband, didn't really have the means to pay for things. All the men did the work. Women didn't really do a lot of work to bring money in. But the issue at hand was they were in debt a little bit. And she needed to pay the debt back. And if she didn't pay the debt back, then her children would be taken from her and used as collateral for that debt as payment, and they would be in slavery.
Right, and so what she does is she goes to Elisha. That's Elisha with an S. I know we're trying to the decipher between the two, and so Elisha says, "What do you want me to do?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what can I do?" And and so she said, and he says, "What do you have in your house?" Which is a good question. You know, if you owe something, start looking around at what you have in your house
Sure.
and what possibly could sell. And she says, "Your maidservant has nothing, except one thing. She has a jar of oil."
So this
And so,
sparked a thought with Elisha, and he told her, he said, I want you to go out and I want you to find borrow vessels from everywhere and all your neighbors, and don't just get a few, he said. He said, go out and get pretty much as you can get. And what are they going to do with these?
and when it says when you bring them all in, and you get inside, you and your sons, put everything inside, shut the door behind you. And so when they did that, he said, what you want to do is start pouring oil into the vessels that you've borrowed.
Mm-hmm. So picking up in verse 6 here, whenever each vessel was full, she told her son to bring her a new pot or a vessel. And finally, they came to a point where he's like, hey, there's no more pots. There's no more vessels, no more vases that we can pour this oil in. And at that point, the oil stopped pouring out. It was gone at that point.
Exactly. And that went all the way through verse number 6. And then verse 7 says, so she came out, told the man of God what she had done.
Mm-hmm.
And so what Elisha, which is now, he's being referred to the man of God
Yep.
in verse 7, which I think that's very important to point out. I could see that being a question here.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, what you need to do is take the oil that you've just poured out, go sell it, pay your debts, and live on what's left.
That's right.
And so
this wasn't Elisha providing this. Who was this providing?
this was God providing this oil.
That's right. And Elisha was just the middleman helping out here. So as we pick up in verse number 8, we see Elisha goes on from that place and he goes to the town of Shunem. And we're going to be introduced to the Shunammite woman, is how this story is conventionally referred to. And so he met this notable woman there. And so she persuaded him to come and eat with her. And that's what he did.
And what she says, she realized that he was passing by there fairly regularly. And so in verse 9, we see where she goes to her husband. And she says, we've got this guy that comes by very regularly.
Yep.
And so as we go into verse 10, what she says, why don't we make him a small room.
Yeah.
So then whenever he comes by, he has a place to stay.
Yep.
And so what happens next?
So he does. He stays there. He goes up and he lays down. And we read in verse 12 that Elisha had a servant.
Right.
And that servant's name was Gehazi. And so Elisha told Gehazi, he said, call this Shunammite woman. And so she came up to him. And so he told her, he told Gehazi to tell, he said, look, we know that you've been concerned for us and you've given us this care. What can I do for you in return? He wanted to repay the favor. And we read that in verse 13. And he said, do you want me to speak on behalf of you for the king or to the commander of the army? And she said, I dwell among my own people.
Okay. And actually in verse 14, it goes on. And so he says again, what then is it to be done for her?
Yeah.
Because she's been so nice. And Gehazi answered, and he actually said, she has no son. She has no son, and her husband is old. So that's what Gehazi's answer was to Elisha, is that, she didn't have any children.
Right. So verse 15, he said, call her. So they called for her, and next thing you know, she's standing at the doorway there.
Right. And what happens is he says to her, about this time next year,
yep,
you're going to be holding a son. He actually says not holding, you're going to be embracing a son.
Yeah.
And so, but the woman, and as we go on into verse 17, but the woman conceived and bore a son in about the appointed time that Elisha had said. And again, it's important to point out that this wasn't Elisha doing all this. This was just Elisha being the mouthpiece of God.
It was.
And all the things that Elisha said were coming true because God was fulfilling them.
No doubt. In verse 18, we see that the child grew just like any child would. And so his dad, it seems like he was in some type of agriculture, because in verse 18 we see that he went out with his father to the reapers. So they were cutting some type of crop down. And while the child was out there, he started complaining that his head was hurting.
Right. He just says, my head.
Yeah, that's
which
right.
I don't know, it might have been the heat, might have been a migraine of some sort that they didn't know about. But what in verse 20, as we see it, the father said, told his servants, take the son back to his mother. And what the mother did once they got back is what any good mother would do. Yep. She sat him on her knee.
Yep.
And he sat there
consoling
him and making sure he was comfortable.
Yep.
And she sat in there until noon. The scripture there in verse 20 says, very specific, he sat there till noon.
Yep.
And then he died right there on his mother's knee.
And can you imagine what was going through her head at this point in time? I mean, to lose anybody is hard, but to lose a child especially. But she obviously mournfully takes her child up in verse 21. She lays him in the bed of the man of God, so meaning the bed where Elisha was staying. And so she shuts the door behind him. And
well, she called her husband in verse 22. Then she called her husband and she said, hey, send me a servant saddled with a donkey that I may run to the man of God.
Yeah.
And that's what she wanted to do. She wanted to go to Elisha because she had seen that he worked this out for her to get the son.
Yeah.
So she probably felt like, I need to go back to this guy.
Sure.
So
makes sense.
Exactly. Made a lot of sense.
Well, in verse 23, we see that the husband asked, he said, why are you going to him today? So he's kind of questioning.
Right.
And it's curious here that she responds in the way she does, but the husband's like, it's not any special occasion like the new moon or the Sabbath. And she said, everything's good. It is well, is what she says. But in verse 24, we see that she saddled her donkey up.
Yeah.
And she gets on her donkey and said to her servants, she said, go forward. Don't slow up whatsoever. We need to get to Elisha.
Exactly. And so as you said there in verse 24, we're in verse 25 now. So she departed. And again, here's a Bible Bowl question. I almost guarantee it. she went to the man of God. Doesn't say who it was. We
Yep.
know it was Elisha, but he's referred to as the man of God at Mount Carmel. So I guarantee you that'll be on there. That in verse 25, he was at Mount Carmel. So she went there, and when it says when the man of God saw her coming from afar off, he sent the servant Gehazi. He said, "Look, the Shunammite woman. Please," verse 26, he says, "Please run out to meet her and see what she wants." And when the servant gets to her, he says, "Is everything okay with your husband?" Again, these are Bible Bowl questions. These are good questions. Is anything wrong with your husband? Is anything wrong with your son? And what she answers is, "It is well."
Just like she told her husband earlier.
It is well.
She's covering up the fact that her son is dead.
Exactly.
So in verse 27, it says, "Now she came up to the man of God at the hill, and she caught him by the feet." So it seems like she threw herself at him and at his feet. But Gehazi came near to push her away, like trying to almost be like a bodyguard, get her away from Elisha. But the man of God, being Elisha, said, "Leave her alone. Her soul is in deep distress, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me about this."
Exactly. And what she says is, "Did I ask a son of my Lord?" And she says, "I didn't say that." And then he goes on, he says, "Do not deceive me." Then he said to Gehazi, which is this Elisha saying to Gehazi, "Get yourself ready. So prepare for this trip. Get my staff in your hand and be on your way." And this is interesting. Again, a couple of Bible questions here. There in verse 29, I believe it is.
29.
"If anyone greets you on the way, do not greet them back. And if you pass anybody on the way, do not greet them."
Keep
so
on going.
basically, just beat that tunnel vision.
Put the blinders on.
Exactly.
But I think the most interesting thing here is what he says to do with that staff.
Yeah.
He says to take that staff, and at the end of verse 29, and lay that staff on the face of a child. Now, hitting a kid in the face with a stick doesn't typically raise them from the dead.
No.
But we see in verse 30, the mother of the child, she responds, says, "As the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." So he arose and he followed her. So they went together.
Yep. And then it also says Gehazi went ahead of them. So, again, I'm trying to point out these things that Bible questions. Where did he walk? Ahead of them, beside them, behind them.
Yeah.
He went ahead of them.
He did.
That in verse 31. But there was neither a voice nor hearing. So as they went, nobody said anything. It was all quiet. And it goes on, "Therefore he went back to meet them, and he said to them, 'This child has not awakened,'" which I'm sure she was like, "Nope."
Sure. Right. I mean, he was dead. Most times, dead people don't awaken.
That's right.
So Elisha, he gets to the house, and he sees the child laying there dead in the bed that was prepared for him, for Elisha.
Yeah.
And he went in, he shut the door behind him. And what did he do here? He prayed to God. Okay? He prayed to God. The stick didn't heal him itself. The prayer from God, we're going to find out, it does.
It does, yeah.
Verse 34 says that he went up and he lay on the child and put his mouth on the child's mouth, and his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands, and stretched himself out on the child. And what happened?
Well, and it says the flesh of the child became warm, which basically meant he was coming back.
That's right.
Life.
We don't want to get morbid, but whenever you die, your flesh, you lose all your blood flow, so therefore your body gets cold and stiff, and this is Elisha bringing it back here.
Well, in verse 35 it says, "And he returned and walked back and forth in the house, and again went up and stretched himself out on him. Then the child sneezed."
Bible question right here.
Right.
This is a question, guaranteed.
The child sneezed 7 times.
Yep.
And opened his eyes. So what he did was he went and walked back and forth in the house. Then he went back in, stretched himself out on the child. Child sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes.
Well, I know some of you are going to know what this means, but that right there is a pool noodle question.
Yeah, that is. And it will be in the peanut gallery ready to come down.
That's right. So if you don't want the noodle, better know he
Sneeze
sneezed seven
times.
So verse 36, Elisha calls out to Gehazi and said, call the Shunammite woman, bring her in. So he did that, and when she came in, Elisha told her, pick up your son. So you know what? Verse 37, we see that she came in and she fell at his feet and bowed to the ground. She picked up her son and she left there. She was very proud and thankful that her son has been risen from the dead.
Yep. So then Elisha, I mean, when your work's done, what do? You return.
That's
so
right.
he returned back to Gilgal. And when he got back there was a famine in the land.
Meaning there wasn't any food available.
It wasn't any food, and it was very dry.
Yep.
Very dry, drought probably creating this famine. And it says, now the sons of the prophets were sitting before him.
Mm-hmm.
And he said to some of his sons, put on a large pot. Put a large pot and boil stew for the sons of the prophets. That's going to be another pool noodle question right there, I think. That he wanted a pot of stew boiled for him.
So what happens, so one person went out in the field and they started gathering the supplies for this, Andy. And so they got some herbs, they got a wild vine, and they've got a lap full of wild gourds. And they sliced all these things up. And so they threw them in the pot. But they didn't know what all this was. It was almost like they went in the field and just started gathering stuff like, oh, that would be good in a stew. It looks like a vegetable.
Yep. Reminds me of polk salad. I don't know if you've had that before.
I have. Not a fan of it.
No, not it. And it sounds like here in verse 40 that they had boiled this stew and they served it to the men. Hey, we made this pot of stew. They served it to the men. And now while they were eating it,
Pretty profound statement.
They cried out to the man of God, and they said, there is death in the pot. Now, I'm going to just go out on a limb, and I would not say as you're eating supper that there is death in the pot. That would not be a good thing.
Or if you want a video you doing that at your house to your mother.